I'm really excited to have you, Christian. This is a really great perspective and getting sharing your webinar on this webinar. The reason being is you have a wealth of experience on implementing numerous technologies that are tied to one platform, not only just from the Kofax space, but also from RPA. You've seen different business models, different ways companies and clients are structuring the way they do things. We want to share your perspective with our listeners, our customer and clients, and also people who are looking to work with us and work for us. In this dialogue, we're going to dig into some of the right processes of strategic transformation and how RPA can really fit into that. And not only solve problems that have been designated and maybe budgeted from a CapEx, OpEx, or even an innovation fund, but more so from the perspective of how do we really take advantage of some of the efficiencies that are out there with our partners, such as Kofax, Strawland, and other organizations that we should have done years ago. So before we kick that off, do you have anything you want to add to your great and incredible background?
No, looking forward to get the conversation going.
So the first start is when an organization from a chief information officer or a VP of IT, or even straight from CFO and CEO, how do they think about the right process or the initial steps to start an RPA implementation?
Well, I think this is the really cool thing that has been transpiring in enterprise software and accelerating over the past couple of years. And to a degree, RPA has forced the subject in that the kind of siloed ivory tower or centralized shared services that will take care of all your needs and you just show up to do your work has begun to disappear. A few years back, there was a really great quote from the CEO of Microsoft that said, basically every company is a software company. And if you're not operating as a software company, that your competitive advantage, is probably very limited. And I think that's proven pretty clear in terms of organizations that have used software very, very effectively to run their businesses. Amazon is a software company, one of the best run companies in the world. Tesla is a software that happens to have wheels, and go on and so on and so forth. So I think the view of those processes that get looked at, more so in organizations that are successful at adopting it, it's really empowering the citizen, developer, the member of the process to be able to participate, because no one knows the frustration of handling a particular process better than the person that's handling the process. Some person in IT, they certainly understand the process of onboarding a user or getting someone a new laptop in an emergency or whatever that may be. But if it's for a particular workflow process, particularly that's core to the business, the people on the front line, they know the pain and the problem better than anyone else, and they've recognized the amount of workarounds or inefficiencies that they experience. So going back to selecting those, where to start. The organizations that we've seen be most effective are those that are able to engage with their team, their people, their constituents in the most constructive, productive way. And there's challenges in doing that. We can get into that a little later. But those that do tend to be able to surface very quickly kind of the bulk of processes that can be evaluated, and then being empowered from then to actually, map out which ones make sense becomes a lot more straightforward. But there are hundreds and hundreds of wins that can be had, that are fairly small, but cumulatively have a tremendous impact. And unlike, workflow projects of, 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I started in this type of activity, the automation space, everything required really big development, really heavy lifting, and that's where really strategic processes were being designed. But where software is today, particularly RPA, I don't think that's the case anymore.
that is a fascinating perspective. All companies are considered software companies, and it's very profound. It's very true. We have clients that range from industrial food manufacturers to organizations that would work with like mortgage technology, and it is all software. Like their efficiencies, their cost centers, everything that they burn capital on, need to overhire for, like throwing people at a way to push, kind of the process through the pipe. All very costly things. Software solves that. In addition to that, implementing software within the software company mindset really kind of has this perspective that you can't just install or implement an RPA and it's going to do it itself. Software needs to constantly evolve, needs to be maintained, it needs to be applied, it needs to be touched up in a way to meet your evolving needs. You said something really, really profound too. The results will stand out, but with RPA, you don't need to, like, it's almost additive, like a small win here, a small win here, a small efficiency improvement here adds up to a larger kind of like ROI. So it doesn't have to be one big, massive sweep. It can be individual kind of installations. If you have these individual RPA implementations, let's say that at you do 20 and they each give you 1% efficiency improvement. Now you have 20% efficiency improvement. How do you is there an industry benchmark to measure that ROI or to measure those benefits on the back of a paper, or do you have to really kind of invest and look at how you're going to get the ROI from implementing this CapEx project?
Yeah, I don't know if there's, really effective ROI tools that span, at that scale, because what we're looking at in many ways are microservices or microprocesses that are being applied. And they're very specific often to the way an organization has worked, operated. You have legacy IT systems that have certain data that need to move to another system, and you're going to, you've had copy paste systems. That's been your automation. So I don't know if that's really the case. I think what we've seen effective organizations do is have, a time study and effort study associated with how certain activities, are taking. How long does it take document A to go from, inbound from the customer to approved? And, generally organizations have a reasonable sense of time and effort that's required there. And then as you apply automation to it, you start to see the results, right? And, I think the really interesting part, where software plays a role is there are friction points in a lot of these activities. And those friction points are usually exception management. And exception management is where most of the cost in an enterprise exists. It's not, when a process works great, the customer is happy, they submitted all their information the right time, the first time, perfect. By and large, those processes are okay. But when there's exception management, that's when things begin to fall apart and get clunky. So I think the organizations that we've looked at have looked at RPA or automation almost as, can this replace, and this we'll get into, the issues that RPA causes as part of the discussion, but can this replace work that's being done by an individual? And what's the return on that, right? And so you essentially are adding digital labor to your organization, and that has very, very clear ROI. If you needed 100 people to do, manage a process, and by automating, you realize you have all these friction points and you have all this overhead, that you can probably do it with, 5 employees because the robots can do the rest of the work. I mean, the ROI can be very exponential, even on small managed steps that are, and on top of that, they're cumulative, right? Now you can do, they work 24/7, they can be compounding against other processes, so the returns can become pretty meaningful. But again, if you're doing this in your industry and your competitor is doing it, it's not like you've got a benchmark of, I'm better than them. It's probably at this point you're just trying to keep up with a lot of organizations that are decided to do the same thing. So I don't know if there's a great ROI calculator. I think it's more so, we have to look at becoming more efficient and operationally more effective, because things are do not make sense for a human being to be doing. It's not a value of human time and effort and capability. We've labeled a whole bunch of people as knowledge worker, information workers, but by and large, they're just moving, data from one place to another and dealing with problems that moving that data is causing. And that's not really maximizing human performance inside an organization.
Sure. And typically, you've seen historically people use RPAs. If I implement an RPA solution and it costs $1, I can replace the work of X percentage of team members. I know that's the older way of kind of looking at RPA, and your statement, it's digital labor. That's a really great way to put it. However, you really complement that really by talking about it's the friction points in a process. Like, for example, getting a customer through a data pipeline to get their car loan approved, or getting an order fulfilled. Each time there's either a manual intervention or a dated legacy software that has to have friction to implement that process. That's where RPA really can free that up and shorten almost like the fulfillment of customers' needs. So you can, book the revenue faster, or, have a better customer experience, or numerous other things. It's also intriguing that you use the term keep up. Like, so many organizations have implemented legacy RPA solutions. And if you're not, as an organization, doing it, you're not being competitive, you're just trying to keep up with them. Can you talk a little bit of organizations that maybe had the innovative kind of insight to be like, you know what, let's implement RPA, but they implemented it 5-6 years ago? How is their system possibly, dated to some of the things that people can do in the space now?
Well, I mean, I think we have a number of customers that were extremely early adopters, had a huge amount of foresight around the capabilities of digital labor. I wouldn't say that they're dated now, because they've continued to innovate and push us in that path. I think what the recognition came, there's a couple of things. One is you might be replacing low cost labor, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily replacing people. You're upskilling people to do higher value activity. And I think that's where they've become exceptional. And I think anybody starting now versus someone who started 5 years ago, I think, although software has improved, I think where those organizations will have had an advantage is they've learned to empower people more effectively probably than those that are just doing it now, because there's a learning curve in going through that activity. There's resistance by individuals to do something that automates them out of the job that they currently do today. And that's a real kind of key point or cornerstone to implementing this, is the change management piece around the human aspect. But I think what has improved overall in software, so the advantages that people have that are starting today is there is a better understanding that RPA on its own doesn't solve the problem, right? RPA is a component of a way to solve a problem. For example, if you can't onboard content effectively, RPA by and large is pretty ineffective. So you have a document, a PDF, a Word document, a tweet that's part of an activity. If you can't intelligently put context around that content, then you have a bottleneck in that someone has to go and say, okay, here's the information from this document, right? So having very, very good document inbound technology, I think, is a critical piece to that activity. Having very good analytics associated with the process. So where is the process falling apart? Can you look at the swim lanes of that particular process? And it could be a simple 3-step process or 4-step process that you built into the robot. But if you can't see, where you're consistently having issues, it becomes a problem. If some of your, circular activity requires you know, the interaction with external parties, right? Do you have an ability to push content to a mobile device? Do you have e-signature capabilities? And sometimes, you know, one of the earlier challenges with people would automate some activities and get really, really fast. And it created this expectation for the customer or the employee or the partner that, hey, this is going really well. And then all of a sudden, all you've created is a dam of bottleneck that now people are going, well, what happened? And we've all had that experience. You know, you put an order in for something, you get a notification, hey, we're managing your order, dot, 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 dot. And then, you know, all of a sudden you're like, well, where's my order? It's like their integration with the shipping company never got figured out. So you're blank. So thinking through the entire life cycle of where you play in these activities as they begin to connect, I think is really became obvious to organizations that have been doing it for a while. And then they needed tools to do that, right? On top of that, even if you were just doing very, very simple RPA, let's just say that you have a whole bunch of robots that are moving data from an ERP system to a line of business system, you know, and you just have thousands of these happening, robots doing this kind of activity. You don't have any, you know, inbound document, nothing complicated. You still have a digital workforce. They're employees. How are you managing? How do you see their performance? What happens when you do a software update to your SAP system and you forgot that there's, you know, 300 robots that depend on that system and now lost connectivity, right? So the management console of robots has become extremely, extremely important. You know, it doesn't matter if you have 5 robots or 10 robots. Okay, you know, somebody can monitor them. But as you grow, you know, and as your organization begins to feel empowered by these activities, you need to actually manage them as people who clock in and clock out and check their performance and have the ability to have oversight on them and understand where their dependencies exist. So, you know, and in a lot of organizations, the reality is that one department will buy one, you know, an RPA tool from one vendor, another department found another one. So now you have 4 or 5 or 6 different platforms. How do you manage that? And I think what we've done very, very well is we've been agnostic to that. Even though we have a very, very powerful, well-recognized RPA tool, you know, we've recognized that the management oversight and all those other pillars that we talked about are important in those activities. So, you know, we've focused on that, and which is why, you know, while we have an RPA tool, we don't call ourselves an RPA company, because we recognize that successful organizations have understand the pillars that are required to be successful in a digital transformation journey, and RPA is a very good early stepping stone to get there. But once you can become effective at that, there are other pillars that you have to put in place to keep up, as we mentioned, with what, you know, other enterprises are doing.
And it's incredible how the industry has moved from let's implement this to have efficiency to like now let's implement this to keep up. And the mindset that these decision makers have to have is this is something that we'll have to continue to invest in, right? It's a tool that will continue to provide dividends and value as we continue to invest in. But one of the key ways to implement and to like almost get the highest efficiency out of the tool that is built for efficiency, you need to look at the key analytics of the outputs, the bottlenecks that are formed, the multiple, you know, bottlenecks that you remove may kind of dam up at the end. And I believe, you know, our CEO and our CEO has a great CIO background. She always saw that, you know, when you do implement it, all these organizations, either different, you know, satellite offices, different business units, different world area offices, they will all implement their own version of this, unless if headquarters and the mothership's not saying, hey, this is what we're going as an organization. And then you have to maintain it, you have to provide updates, and you have to really identify using the analytic tools, the human intelligence, on which pillars are you really going to tackle first. How does Kofax kind of speed this process up? How does Kofax really kind of accelerate this you know, experienced, profound methodology of implementing not only RPA, but the entire a platform to support to get the highest results?
Well, I think when organizations realize that a digital transformation journey requires a number of tools to be successful, and it takes a while to get to that understanding for many organizations because you only see certain pieces, right? I'll give you an example. We went into an organization. They really wanted to automate. They dealt with transportation and logistics. They really wanted to automate some of the activities they wanted to do. It had some grand visions around RPA, but the reality was that 80% of their content was on paper, and they'd never once occurred to them that they needed scanners, right? $1 billion business, and transforming themselves into the new digital era. And it's like, well, you don't deal with that paper, you're not going anywhere. So I think when customers have the opportunity to speak with Kofax, one of the things that we bring to the table is an understanding of the pillars that are involved in these activities, such as simple as scanning a piece of a paper inbound to, hey, is there mobile activity required here, right? Does someone need to take a picture of a document or a driver's license or something? In telecom, we've automated a number of exceptional processes for some very well known and very efficient telecom companies, and that KYC aspect is an incredibly slow, burdensome process for many of these organizations to, open new accounts, and it's an expensive process. So how do you get through that and recognizing that a lot of the customers, they need to provide a driver's license, they need to provide proof that they have a utility bill, they need to, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not going to scan that. They're not going to go back home and bring it back to the office. So the phone becomes a really important piece. Well, does the stack that you have access to have that, and how hard is it to integrate into the workflow that you have, right? And so on and so forth. So there are typically 7 key pillars that are needed to be really effective at digital transformation. And I think what we've been able to do is, through massive investments in R&D, acquisitions that we've made, we've been able to put together a platform where an organization can start with the simplest of things that they need to at their point in their journey, and then grow from there by just switching on the other features without having to say, okay, well, I got that, but now I have to go and evaluate and buy another platform, and oh, I didn't realize I needed this. And now you have all these stages of development and growth, or very, very inexpensive and complex integration activities that you need to do and make sure that there's no failure points in between them, and that you're compliant. You're dealing with a lot of data in most of these cases that are business critical data. If you're automating these activities, it's likely that they have material value to your organization. And so now you're having to manage compliance for 4 or 5 different systems. So what we've been able to do is have world-class, capabilities in, capture, OCR, document transformation, business process automation, RPA, case management activities, analytical activities, closing the loop with e-signature activities, and so on, so that over time, an organization can say, look, you know what, I really do have to start today by just onboarding content. I have no way to onboard content, or realize that they have multi-channel onboarding. Customers, in a bank scenario, may still want to go to the branch. Other people want to do everything on a mobile device, and other people, do it on the website. And then you have people who are hybrid. They'll do 50% here and 50% there. So I think that's how we've helped companies be successful, is through the original discovery activities, help them recognize the type of tools they will need. And for us, you can switch on just one application, or you can switch on all of them. It's fine. We don't need to own the entire lifecycle stack for a customer, but at least that awareness ensures that the tail risk of only getting halfway done in a process development doesn't become an issue. When you're actually beginning to deploy, and you realize that, hey, these investments we made, all the training that we did for employees, all of this process development only got us 10% of the way there, or 20% of the way there in our automation journey that we expected.
That's great. And we'll definitely share a link to the 7 pillars that you just described when this goes out. You'll see the link below. And you've listed that there's a number subset of tools, and it can be kind of daunting and almost intimidating. Like, I have all these tools in an incredible platform. They don't know where to implement. When a customer says, listen, either they want to go to the next gen RPA or they want to like really implement an RPA, what's like a really simple question they should ask about either their processes, about their organization, that you say like, yeah, we need it soon. We need to partner like Kofax or Strawman to really implement this. What would they need to ask themselves?
Well, I think clarity of the outcome is critical. I think a lot of organizations get excited because they can automate, but they haven't stopped and really said, hey, what's the outcome that we really, really want? And oftentimes, that automation or that outcome may require them to rethink how they're doing something. There's a lot of scenarios where, we've seen organizations basically want to automate exactly how they're doing things today. So they just want to put software over it. And maybe there's reasons for that. Maybe there's regulatory reasons that you must follow, these 5-6 steps. Okay, that's fine. But more often than not, it comes from a lack of a willingness to say, hey, is there an optimal way? And, we often have gone into organizations where, people want to design a 25, 30 step workflow. And it's daunting, but is what can be eliminated? What steps are unnecessary? What things can software begin to, make obsolete? And again, we haven't touched a ton on it, but the change management aspect, giving the organization confidence that these things will empower employees to do higher value work becomes a critical piece. If not, there's a lot of, preservation work that may begin to happen in an organization where people are like, well, you're eliminating my department by automating all this stuff, kind of thing, right? So I think it's really important to define the outcome clearly and be very, very clear. So an organization like yours, the value bring is that outside perspective, and having seen multiple other industries and other organizations, and providing that clarity of, well, is that really what you want to provide? Is that, what's the customer experience really looking to be? And a lot of organizations have, empowered people in CX roles to take on that initiative internally, to say, hey, this is who we're going to be, and this is what we expect to deliver to our end customers. So the processes then can be defined against that. Otherwise, you kind of start to develop in a vacuum, and it becomes overhead. Processes, the automation becomes overhead versus value add.
It's so intuitive, right? Define what success looks like. You have so many voices, you have so many votes, you have so many stakeholders. You have people coming top down, and will it be adopted? You have people who are actually doing the work and say, like, that's not going to work. But there is a big difference between like 25 steps and 24, from 4 steps to 3. Those are massive improvements, especially when you have these, as you said, $1 billion a year revenue companies or $200 million. These one-step elimination is powerful, and it's applicable to every aspect of people's life. By eliminating, inefficiencies in your day-to-day as just a human, provides a lot of efficiencies, and to do it at a large-scale enterprise like that really helps. That is a really great start to kind of some of the best practices, defining success when implementing an RPA. What would be like a second step?
I think the second step is the people part in an organization. I think there naturally is going to be resistance and fear to these kind of tools. So how it's communicated internally, what types of steps are being done to empower people to learn to upskill. If you learn to build robots, and you learn to build automation, you learn to discover friction within the organization and document it in ways that they can be acted upon, then people realize that there's an infinite possibility of what you can do in an organization and automate an organization there. And while their job of doing step 1 to step 2 that they've been doing for a long time might disappear, or likely is to disappear, if organizations do it well, I think what the outcome is people begin to add exponentially more value to the organization. So we've had organizations that have given robots names. They give them a birth date. This is the day they were born. They name them, and this is activity they've done. And they've created a culture of, hey, like, these are your partners, right? And as an individual, you have, 10 or 15 digital, colleagues that help accomplish the work that wasn't a great use of your time to start with, and now you monitor, manage, you optimize, you do a couple of things with them, right? So I think that change management piece is really, really important, and one that we're not really accustomed at doing at scale. Organizations traditionally have done very large IT projects, maybe an ERP, and you train people and you talk about it. But when it's something as agile and as in some ways intimate as something that's affecting the day-to-day job that Rav do, it's a very, very different experience relationship, and we've sort of gotten accustomed to this integration of technology in our consumer life. We have, we talk to Siri, there's things, that remind us when we have to wake up or take pills or exercise, and we view them as additive to our life. But consumer tech has done a very good job of kind of in design, in the way they market to us, to make us accept that, hey, it's okay to have a phone or a watch telling you, hey, you didn't stand up enough today, right? But in the business sector and the enterprise sector, we kind of treat software so formally that there's that resistance that it's not helpful, and a lot of it's so clunky that oftentimes software isn't that helpful. So I think the second step, the really key thing is culturally an organization making the choice to say, this is part of our organization, and on top of that, it's a way to empower our organization. Yes, there may be people who can't go through the journey, who aren't going to upskill, don't want to upskill, and so on. But if the mindset of the organization is, no, we're going to reduce 80% of our workforce, believe me, you're going to have a really, really tough time going down that path. That innovation curve is going to be difficult. But you look at organizations, and again, I'll pick on Amazon again. They're one of the largest employers in the world with one of the greatest amount of automation in the world. So there's lots of room for people to add value if you can get people behind that automation activity and recognizing that they could add value by being part of and collaborative with that digital technology.
And that's incredible. You stated that you almost humanize it. Like, some people give the robots a birthday, and this is, as more and more automation across all industries, not just in RPA, proliferate our work lives, giving it a birthday, giving it almost an identity, and then, unlike consumer, it's going to make our lives and us better, right? And it's almost not it's he, because there's a birthday and there's an implementation date. And you brought this great statement: when first is define success, eliminate steps, then look at the cultural kind of like acceptance and almost embracing the technology from a people standpoint. And with that people standpoint, is there an ideal, just from your experience, ideal team composition, skill sets of those team members? And how does that really affect on the maintenance and management once it's implemented?
A lot of the software, has become citizen developer friendly. So the, if someone can work on a spreadsheet, has, reasonable command of their desktop, in a lot of cases, they can be very active participants and collaborators of these activities. There's always going to be exception management. Software hasn't solved all problems. So, people who, are very good at at dealing with those exceptions and then figuring out ways in which, potentially software over time can participate in helping, those friction points, I think becomes a kind of a second layer to it. But in terms of ideal composition, I think this is where organizations, get to be unique and get to begin to add their own, flavor and stamp and DNA in these activities. And that's driven again by decisions around what's the experience that the organization is looking to provide, and how do people participate in that. So you may end up having more people that do, soft communication, with soft skill communication with customers or other players, and keep the dialogue going there. Whereas, the procedural steps, the robots handling the automation, the actual robot part. So I think there's room for experimentation. I'm not sure that, any organization has a monopoly on those kind of activities. A lot of people have set up COEs around this to go. I think the real interesting part is the companies that we've seen have success. They're very much learning organizations now, and they're watching what, hey, look, that team, I mean, the notion of naming robots wasn't like a CTO decision, right? It was some department started having fun with it. They felt empowered, and then that became a standard that came across the rest of the organization. So I think becoming a learning organization becomes an extremely effective way to share skills, share practices, and understand, where they're going to be most effective. Because again, it's cultural, right? It becomes part of the culture and DNA of the business to take on something like this. But in basic terms, you do need some development staff. You need some back-end people who can manage and orchestrate and ensure that, the compliance pieces are in place. If you're running it on premise, the server uptime. If you're running it in the cloud, that, the integrations are operating there. You'll have people who are actively developing, more robots than others, and you'll have people who may participate in tweaking them, and you may have people who just run them and participate in the exceptions or the managed exceptions. So depending on the scale of the process, they're just like their software stack. If if every company is a software company, then you'll have similar levels of, people across the board. Even people who just test robots and put them through the paces and try to break them, are oftentimes roles that begin to take place.
We have learned that the exception management can be a really key hurdle, especially because a lot of the times, sometimes when you're implementing an RPA solution, exception management, you don't know where it's going to have that, right? It can be a gotcha, and sometimes it can be big and sometimes it's small. Being big issue is not actually a bad thing, especially the way kind of we structure at Strawman, right? We work with all aspects of the organization, right? There's PMO, IT, HR, legal compliance. We work with an executive sponsor on both sides, right? Typically, there's a board depending on the size and magnitude of the expense for this project. And then procurement and finance is a constant group that we work with to really support so they can measure ROI. In our perspective also, we really love to have like a BI, a Power BI, or someone who has the ability to really document. Documentation is really key. Have you seen examples where if it's not documented right, it can really cause problems?
Yeah, like we started off talking about, understanding your current state, your as is state, is really, really important. And at the same time, we also discussed, people wanting to automate exactly as is, and just put software against it can also become a problem. I think there has to be comfort in recognizing that things are broken and being okay to discuss that things are broken. And in a lot of organizations, that can be challenging because it's somewhat been hidden. People have done workarounds for a long time around a particular activity, and that's how they've protected their job, but they've also created the illusion that everything is a-okay. So I think having that willingness to document and say this is the reality, these are the problems we face, this is where we're running into challenges, I think is a really critical step. And so in that early part of the journey of going down this path, oftentimes the early projects set the tone and the stage of how it rolls out further, right? And the great thing, even in our software, is you can run scenarios, you can run things that aren't live, you're emulating, so to speak. And this allows for an organization to make a decision: is, do we run towards pain or do we hide from it, right? And if you run towards it, you say, okay, man, that's really bad. We didn't realize that, every time we try to run a process and the user is on an Android, they give up because there's something difficult there, right? Or in other places, people will say, well, let's bury it under the table, right? Like, no one knows, that kind of thing. And I think is really interesting, and this is why early on in a lot of the projects, partners like yourselves will partner directly with Kofax Professional Services, because we're used to having those discussions of saying, hey, look, this is actually an incredible opportunity. And if you set the tone that problem is an opportunity, a kind of like a blessing in disguise, that if you learn to tackle these problems and you give the impression to the organization, to the rest of your team, that resolving it produces these wins, and you celebrate those wins, it kind of becomes a flywheel effect internally from that perspective. But it is very difficult early on to, someone in the role who really needs to be part of it to, surface, in a document that, hey, yeah, by the way, we're not very good at doing our job. We've been hiding it, right? And I'm being a bit extreme in the way that I'm presenting it, but that documentation part is a critical starting point to go, okay, this is our as is state, and as a result, this is the experience, customer experience, employee experience, partner experience that we're delivering as a result of how we do things today.
And Strauland really specializes in private equity portfolio companies, right? Organizations, SaaS enterprise software, financial institutions. They do a really great job of working with these portfolio companies that where you can have a hard conversation, as you put it. You can have the hard discussion, like, this is what needs to be fixed. And it's not a difficult conversation because they understand, as a newly acquired or existing acquired, that there's efficiencies that can be there, because that was partly identified in the acquisition of the portfolio company. Where does kind of RPA what industries does RPA really shine in? Like, is it healthcare? And what drives, why RPA does well in those industries versus others?
I mean, the reality is that RPA is having an impact, a transformation across all industries. I think really early adopters were banks, telecom companies, and transportation and logistics, in part because there is a significant amount of paper flow that was required in those organizations to fulfill a transaction. And paper flow creates a huge data burden of things that need to get checked, verified, and validated, for which RPA, the goal of the RPA was to help, optimize those activities. That's where, as we discussed, there was a recognition of need to attach other tools at the beginning to it, onboarding for documents, those kind of things. But in those particular industries, the reason I believe that they were such early adopters quickly was the value of each transaction, of each step, had a material impact on the bottom line, right? A bank doing 1 million transactions versus another bank doing 1 million transactions, if you can save 1 cent on each transaction, and that's 1 million a day, it's a big deal. So the need to optimize is critical. Logistics, up until recently, logistics, very tight, difficult business in terms of competing margins. So, not only the time, the expectation of time, but the cost to manage it. Any cost that can be extracted was, a huge benefit. And you're dealing with bill of ladings and those kind of things, right? Most of telecom's costs with customer on the onboarding process, and then over time they begin to pay themselves off as part of being part of the network. So anything that reduced that cost and got them on board quicker. So I think in scenarios where organizations have a real, commercial need to reduce the way that they operate, RPA has been a really interesting kind of driver of that conversation, impetus driver for that. And then from there on in, it's expanded, particularly around financial process automation. We've seen a lot of RPA being added to some, for example, our own FPA tools like ReadSoft or our accounts payable tools, where people say, okay, I have a good process, but I want to now optimize how I get stuff from suppliers or how I get stuff from customers or how I send alerts and reminders, to make that process from, time to cash much, much faster. So, I think that's been the more vertical kind of, use case, but in those industries, the ones that I mentioned were the early adopters, but now it's universities, it's government institutions, railroads. It's pretty amazing how much innovation we get to see as a result of the platform we have.
That's incredible. It's almost proliferated across like all industries around the globe, and it's almost needed more, like the ports in Los Angeles here, right? Data technologies, highly manual processes. I think there's a big initiative to implement some RPAs to reduce the average boat from being at the port for, I think it's like 8.6 days. And just in the first iteration of RPA, they're going to be able to reduce it by like 40%. And that's like version 1. Version 2, maintenance and the implementation and support of that will get it down another 25, 40%. I'm going to ask you one last question, and I know we got a lot of questions from the listeners right now. Kind of, how do you see the future of not only just RPA and automation, AI, ML assisted automation? Is that better? Like, where do you see the future of RPA going?
Yeah, I think AI and machine learning, natural language processing, all become extremely additive to what's happening, right? Where systems that can learn from the interactions they're having and provide that feedback with human input, I think accelerate the adoption. I mean, we've had, we didn't have, the sexy terms that are used today, but, from our legacy from, 15 years ago, we've had systems in which a document would come in, an operator would help classify, understand it. It became part of the knowledge base of the software. So the next time a similar document came in, it had a level of confidence as to, yes, I'm very confident that this is exactly the same thing, and I can proceed to, I'm only so confident, and based on the rules, if it's only so confident, it's going to shoot it back to an operator until it's getting to 100% confidence. And I think as we see the application of those kinds of activities to RPA, to saying, look, you know what, yeah, this is running pretty good, but we seem to be getting this exception management, and because software can see across a large spectrum, it can see patterns much faster than we can as humans. It can flag those things for a user, an organization, to say, hey, we can optimize here, right? So I think that becomes a really, really interesting application, particularly around unstructured content, because it's so difficult to deal with unstructured content in an enterprise. And a huge part of the content in an enterprise is unstructured. It's great when it's in an ERP system. Beautiful. It came into a database and beautifully parsed. Wonderful. But you get documents, you get emails, you get text, you get SMS, you get recorded phone calls, all those kind of things. How do you manage those activities? I think there's a lot of value with artificial intelligence and those tools to help optimize our ability to see patterns or surface those patterns, and then put them into process activities that we can then assess how we can optimize those processes. And we're going to create more data. We're going to create more flow, and more are doing the same thing. The innovation that's required within the enterprise to reduce friction becomes more urgent. So any of these tools that help see, macro pictures within the enterprise, I think will be exponential to those that are willing to take the time to look at them.
That's amazing. That's incredible. It really, I mean, just your wealth of knowledge also shows why Kofax is a leader in the space and really can see and support customers. And we're really, I know Strong's really grateful to be a partner and implement the technology and really bring those efficiencies and work together. I do got a couple of questions from some listeners. One is, do you recommend BPR exercise prior to implementation of RPA for any biz process?
So, and BPR referring to a business process review, just to make sure we're using the right acronym.
Correct. I believe so, yes.
Yeah, again, I don't believe organizations need to do such heavy lifting for everything, right? So in some organizations, I think it's okay, in some departments to say, hey, we have some robots, let's go experiment and make a small investment at getting something in there so you can get started. I think the era of doing really, really large scale projects from the get-go, I think it's hard to sell internally. It's slow and not that efficient for everything. I think over time you get there, and I think it's a parallel course where a tool like Kofax's, you can, acquire a license for reasonable cost, say, okay, we're going to, empower a certain amount of citizen developers to go experiment and work on some things because we know there's some friction points, while at the same time, the organization is looking at the broader transformational strategy and looking at it top down and bottom up. I think I've seen that to be a very, very effective strategy. But if you wait to do an entire business process review and a whole transformation project, you might be 18 months out before the document's ready. And I really do believe that organizations that aren't actively automating today, have risk compared to their peers who, are actively automating. So I think there's a need to be diligent and do the strategic stuff, but I think there's also a need to, put shovels out in the field and let's just start digging.
Yeah, and it's not like you need to shut aspects of the company down to do this.
No.
You can have partners like Strawin, partners like Kofax, other organizations. Bring partners in, have them do an assessment, have them do a review. Really do it in parallel. It's 5% of a team member, a stakeholder's time for like a month. It's not a lot. It's not a huge investment, and really kind of map it out quickly, swiftly. Get it on paper. Like you said, don't spend the 18 months before you do it. Start now. Should have started. I mean, the best time to start is 10 years ago. Second best time to start is now. Amazing. Security is always a consistent issue. One of the listeners is asking, do you have kind of an understanding, or kind of can you share some of the built-in security features of Kofax RPA tools or the platform that maybe that are relevant in the time that we are now?
Yeah, I mean, the basic, standard security for enterprise software, are built in. I think the beauty that we've had as an organization is because we've been around for a long time. We have some of the largest companies in the world as our customers. When we rolled in RPA into the stack, it had to meet that, encryption, security, tools to manage sensitive data, compliance, ability to fit into compliance frameworks, SOC 2 or whatever. So those kind of things are built core into the platform. We have lots of articles on our website and documentation around how we deal with those things, and the fact that we power, meaningful institutions, banks that have zero tolerance for risk with these systems, has given us, kind of that enterprise confidence, where some of, newer RPA tools are very innovative and very cool, but they haven't gone through the learning curves and the hiccups that we've had to go through And we had to do that in advance of putting it out to our customers, right? They wouldn't accept an add-on that, oh, well, okay, this is a kind of a cool new innovative tool. No, it had to be enterprise standard from the get-go.
Yeah, almost battle mode tested. We have clients that leverage leverage Stralin's background in application security, cloud security, because with also the remote work and people being in different areas, there's so many areas where security can be an issue. But the chairman of Stralin, being the CIO, Phillips, and understanding security and really investing in providing that security. That's why Kofax was a really great partner for Stralin. Security was really built in. Well, Christian, I'm really grateful, and I want to thank you, and the listeners want to thank you for everything you've shared. You have a wealth of experience. Kofax has a history of really providing success for its customers and industries all over the world. Your statement to kick it off in the beginning, every organization is a software company. Software does touch every aspect of innovative companies. And if you're not really investing, looking at software as a mindset, as a perspective, and a part of your culture, you can get left behind and not be very competitive very quickly. I'll put your background, some of the slides discussed, and some of the links that we discussed on Strong and Kofax will be shared. I just want to say thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. I appreciate having you guys as a partner in the skill set you bring to helping organizations think through, a very difficult but also compelling transformation, story, which I don't think we've really experienced the scale of opportunity to innovate in the enterprise like we're doing today, because software has become so much more accessible. So appreciate you guys, and great having this chat, Rob.
Awesome. Cheers.